On a winter morning in 1961, if you stood at the end of the platform at King's Cross and waited, you heard it before you saw it. Not the even beat of an ordinary diesel. Something stranger. A high, hard, mechanical snarl. 3 separate rhythms pulling against each other until they locked into one. Listen to it now. That sound came from an engine unlike anything else ever put into service anywhere in the world. 3 banks of cylinders arranged as the sides of a triangle. 18 cylinders, 36 pistons, 3 crankshafts geared together, and not a single cylinder head anywhere in the design. It powered Royal Navy attack craft. It swept mines off the British coast for 4 decades. It hauled the Flying Scotsman out of London at 100 miles an hour. It was, by almost any measure, the most brilliant diesel engine Britain ever produced. And in 1982, within months of the last one coming out of service, most of the locomotives that carried it were cut apart for scrap. Several of them had just been fully overhauled. Several of them ran perfectly. To understand why a country destroys its finest engine, you have to go back to a fire in a Belgian harbour, a company with nothing left to build, and a civil servant whose name almost nobody remembers, who solved the one problem that made the whole thing possible. This is the story of the Napier Deltic. Walk into the Napier Works at Acton in West London in 1944 and make your way towards the test cells, and the building itself seems to shake. On the bench, running up to full power, is the Napier Sabre. 24 cylinders, sleeve valves, 2,400 horsepower from a single piston aero engine, the most intricate power plant in British production, and the summit of everything this firm has learned across a century. The test crews wear ear defenders and speak in hand signals, because nothing human can be heard over a Sabre at full throttle. Out on the floor, the fitters work to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. On sleeve valves that must glide inside their cylinders without a tremor at 3,000 revolutions a minute. This is not mass production. It is watchmaking at the scale of a war. Men serve 7-year apprenticeships here and consider themselves beginners for several more. The firm's whole character is in that room. Absolute precision, absolute complexity, and absolute confidence that both can be made to work. Because Napier is old. D. Napier and Son took its name in 1848, when James Murdoch Napier joined his father David in the family workshop in Soho. By 1895, the business had all but died, down to a handful of men, and it was James's son Montague who inherited the remains and turned the firm towards engines. Through the First World War, Napier built aero engines. Through the 1920s, the Napier Lion, a broad arrow 12-cylinder, took world records on land, on water and in the air, and it was still taking them in 1947 when John Cobb drove a Lion-engined car to a new land speed record on the Salt at Bonneville. The Sabre carried the firm to the very edge of what a piston aero engine could ever be. The man at the front of it was Major Frank Halford, consultant to Napier from 1928 and technical director from 1935, the designer whose gypsy engines had powered de Havilland's light aircraft between the wars. The Sabre was never his alone. Napier engineers George Wilkinson, Ernest Chatterton and Ben Barlow took his concept and made it into something a factory could actually produce. But Halford was the name, and the Sabre was the peak. What nobody at Acton wanted to say aloud was that the peak is also the place from which every road leads down. When I went back through the records of this period, one detail stopped me completely. From April 1941, while Sabre production was straining Napier to breaking point, Halford was working on a second engine. Not at Acton, for de Havilland, a centrifugal flow turbojet, the Halford H1. It ran for the first time in April 1942. It flew in a Gloucester Meteor on the 5th of March 1943. Hold that in your mind for a moment. The man responsible for the engine that defined the Hawker Typhoon was, at the same time, in a different room, creating the technology that would render every piston aero engine on Earth obsolete. He did not betray Napier. He simply read where the future was going, and he read it correctly. By 1944, he was running the de Havilland Engine Company, and by 1946, Napier was a precision engineering firm of the first rank, with absolutely nothing to make. By then, the firm no longer even belonged to itself. In December 1942, with Sabre production in crisis, and the Ministry of Aircraft Production already routing sleeve manufacture through Bristol, the wartime government pushed Napier into the English Electric Group. English Electric installed a new managing director, Henry George Nelson, son of the group's chairman Sir George Nelson, and still in his early 30s. Halford was moved aside. A century of independence was over. Napier now existed to do whatever its parent company found for it to do. And it was the Royal Navy that was about to tell them what that would be. For most of the war, British motor torpedo boats ran on petrol burns. The captured German fast attack boats, the Schnellboote, ran on Daimler-Benz diesels, and diesels do not. The Admiralty had known the difference for years. On the 14th of February 1945, it stopped being an abstraction. In the basin at Ostend Harbour, fuel discharged from a Canadian boat spread across the surface of the water and caught. The fire ran from hull to hull in seconds. 12 boats were destroyed, 5 Canadian and 7 British. 26 Royal Canadian Navy sailors died. 35 Royal Navy sailors died. 61 men gone in a single afternoon in a harbour that was supposed to be safe. The petrol engine in a small warship was no longer a compromise. It was a strategic liability with a body count. The engineering answer had already been framed. From October 1943 to March 1944, Sir Roy Fedden had chaired the MTB Power Unit Committee, and its report called for a new lightweight, high-power diesel, an H-configuration sleeve valve unit, in effect a diesel version of the Sabre. Herbert Salmons of Napier sat on that committee. But when English Electric and Napier came forward with their proposal, it was not the engine the report had described. It was something far stranger, a triangular opposed piston design drawing on work Napier had done under license from Junkers before the war. In 1946, the Admiralty awarded Napier the development contract. The firm that had lost its purpose had just been handed a new one. There was only one difficulty. The engine that would save Napier was an engine that nobody, anywhere, had ever built. And if the idea of a company betting its entire existence on an impossible drawing has its hooks in you already, subscribe now because that engine is about to conquer the sea, then the railway, and then be destroyed by the very people it saved. And stories like that one are what this channel is built on. The man whose drawings had to make it real was Ernest Edward Chatterton, chief engineer of Napier's piston engine division, with designers George Murray and Ben Barlow alongside him and the young Henry Nelson watching over the whole project from above. What Chatterton's team put on paper looked less like an engine than a proof in geometry. 3 banks of 6 cylinders, arranged as the 3 sides of an equilateral triangle, 18 cylinders, and inside them 36 pistons, because each cylinder held 2 facing one another. At each corner of the triangle, a crankshaft, and the 3 crankshafts geared together at one end of the engine. There were no cylinder heads at all. The 2 pistons in every cylinder ran towards each other, and combustion happened in the space between them. The shape gave the engine its name, after the Greek letter delta. It was elegant, it was compact, it was ferociously power-dense, and it contained a flaw that threatened to end the entire project on the drawing board. With 3 crankshafts arranged in a triangle, the piston motions refused to reconcile. For the geometry to work at all, 2 of the crankshafts had to rotate one way, and the third had to rotate the other. Without an answer to that, the engine was not an engine. It was a sculpture. The answer did not come from inside Napier. It came from the customer. In the drawing office of the Admiralty Engineering Laboratory, a senior draftsman named Penn Warden proposed the reverse rotation gearing that let the third crankshaft turn against its neighbours. I want to pause on that name because history has not been generous to it. Pen Warden was not a director. He was not a chief engineer. He was a civil servant at a drawing board. And the single most important mechanical problem in the most radical British engine of the century was solved by him from outside the company and then largely forgotten. Every Deltic that ever ran because of Pen Warden's gear. There was precedent for the rest of it. In the 1930s, Napier had built 7 culverin engines under license from Junkers, straight-opposed piston aerodiesels descended from the Jumo 204. In a sense, the Deltic was 3 culverins folded around each other into a closed triangle. But precedent only carries you so far. When I was working through the Admiralty papers, I found myself checking the same point twice, because it reads like an error. Napier genuinely proposed, and the Royal Navy genuinely accepted, a frontline engine with no cylinder heads whatsoever, on a configuration that existed nowhere in the world. The officer who signed the contract had no proof it would work. Neither did the men who would build it. They were going to find out together, on the testbed, with the future of the firm riding on the result. The single-cylinder test unit ran in January 1947. A 3-cylinder unit followed that October and was abandoned because of vibration. The first full 18-cylinder engine, designated D.18.1, ran on the bench at Acton in April 1950. And by January 1952, 6 development engines were running. In 1949, as the project moved from paper to metal, Herbert Salmons took over its leadership, the same Salmons who had sat on the Fedden Committee in 1943. The man who had helped pose the question was now answerable for the answer, and the men standing beside those test beds already understood something the Royal Navy would not fully grasp for another decade. 3 crankshafts had to be timed to one another within a fraction of a degree, through a phasing gear train that demanded hands, which knew precisely what they were doing. In 1950, the number of such hands in existence was, more or less, the number of people who had built the engine. Remember that. It is the seed of everything that happens at the end of this story. The reckoning came at HMS Hornet in Gosport from late 1951. 2 development engines, D-18-4 and D-18-5, were installed in a captured German Schnellboot, running under Royal Navy pennant P5212, and set head-to-head against the Daimler-Benz MB511, the very engine the Deltic had been conceived to beat. Salmons and his team stood watching. If the British engine lost to the German one, the contract would fall, and Napier would fall with it. The engine did not lose. It outperformed the unit it had been designed to answer in the hull that unit had been built for. The Admiralty was convinced. The Dark-class fast attack craft became the first operational application. Then came the boats that would carry the Deltic longest of all. The Ton-class coastal minesweepers, around 119 of them, were built with wooden hulls so as not to trigger magnetic mines, and a wooden warship imposes brutal limits on weight. The Deltic was the engine light enough to give those boats the power they needed. They entered service in the mid-1950s, and some were still serving in the 1990s. HMS Wilton, the fiberglass-hulled prototype, was not decommissioned until 1994, 40 years of operational life on an engineering platform frozen in 1950. To stand in the engine room of a ton with a Deltic turning was to stand inside the Sound itself, the triangular block hard against the hull, warm oil in the close air of a wooden ship, the deck plates trembling up through your boots, 3 crankshafts arguing their way into agreement a few feet from your chest. Starting one was a ritual in itself. The engine turned over slowly at first, reluctant, coughing blue smoke into the compartment, and then caught, one bank at a time, until the whole triangle was alive, and the note climbed into that hard, ringing snarl that no other machine ever made. Young stokers learned it the way farmers learn weather. A Deltic warming through sounded one way. A Deltic with trouble coming sounded another, and the difference lived in instinct rather than instruments. On patrol at night, the sound carried across miles of dark water, and every fisherman on that stretch of coast knew exactly what was passing. The men who served with them never forgot it. Napier had been rescued by its own audacity. But the engine's greatest stage, and the beginning of its undoing, lay inland. Because in 1955, the railway came calling. That year, British Railways announced its modernisation plan. Steam was to go, and the East Coast Main Line, 400 miles from King's Cross to Edinburgh over the racing ground, where Gresley's Pacifics had made their names, needed a diesel that could hold the schedules the A4s had been keeping for 20 years. Nothing in the British Railways programme could do it. Inside English Electric, two men saw what nobody else saw. Sir George Nelson, the chairman, and his son Henry, who had run Napier through the war, understood that the Marine Deltic could become the heart of a locomotive, and in 1955 they authorised a prototype as a private venture, built entirely at the company's own risk, with no order from British Railways at all. DP1 emerged that year from English Electric's Dick, Kerr Works in Preston. Two Deltic engines, derated from their marine rating of 1,750 horsepower to 1,650 each, giving 3,300 horsepower in a machine of a little over 100 tons, finished in powder blue and cream, with one word in capitals along each flank. Deltic. Sir George Nelson unveiled it in October 1955, 5 years before he became Lord Nelson of Stafford. The prototype went first to the London Midland region, hauling fast freight between Liverpool and London. The region's mechanical and electrical engineer at Derby, John Frederick Harrison, Freddie to everyone who worked with him, was not persuaded. Too high revving, too unfamiliar, too specialised. The London Midland turned away from the Deltic and put its faith in electrification instead. Then, 3 years later, in October 1958, Freddie Harrison was appointed Chief Mechanical Engineer of British Railways. The man who had rejected the engine at Derby was now the man responsible for introducing it to the nation. Institutions have long memories, and so do engineers. DP1 itself ran in revenue service for 6 years and roughly 450,000 miles before a failed oil pipe in the phasing gear train made one of its engines uneconomic to repair, and it was withdrawn in March 1961. By then, it no longer mattered. The prototype had done its real work, which was to convince one particular man. That man was Gerard Francis Gisborne Twistleton Wycombe Fiennes, born on the 7th of June 1906, Winchester and Hertford College, Oxford, a traffic apprentice on the LNER from 1928, and a distant relation of 2 actors and an explorer who would later carry the family name into public view. Everyone on the railway called him Jerry Fiennes. From 1957 to 1961, he was line traffic manager of the Great Northern Line, working out of King's Cross, and his case was arithmetic rather than romance. To survive against the new motorways and the airlines, the East Coast had to run end-to-end at an average of 75 miles an hour or better. No conventional British diesel then in existence could deliver that. The Deltic could. DP1 transferred to the Eastern region in January 1959, and the order had already been placed in March 1958. 22 production locomotives, designated Class 55, at £155,000 each, a total contract of £3,410,000, and bound into it a 5-year maintenance agreement with English Electric, the first service contract British Railways had ever signed on any class of locomotive. Note that clause. It is quiet now. It will not stay quiet. The locomotives were built at the Vulcan Foundry at Newton-le-Willows, a works founded in 1830 with Robert Stephenson, son of George, among its first partners. And when they entered service, the depots gave them names in the old manner. Finsbury Park in London named its allocation after racehorses, In the LNER tradition, Royal Scots Grey, Meld, Crapello, Tulia, St. Paddy. Gateshead named its machines for the regiments of the North East, the Green Howards, the Durham Light Infantry, Royal Northumberland Fusiliers. Haymarket in Edinburgh chose the Scottish regiments, King's Own Scottish Borderer, Royal Highland Fusilier. There was intent in this. These were not fleet numbers. These were locomotives that were meant to carry meaning, and the men who crewed them treated them accordingly. D9001, St. Paddy, entered service from Finsbury Park on the 23rd of February 1961. D9000, Royal Scots Grey, followed from Haymarket 5 days later. By 1962, all 22 were at work, and an entire generation of Gresley and Peppercorn Pacifics, the whole of the A4 class among them, was displaced by a fleet you could count on your fingers and toes. Consider what those 22 machines were actually doing. Day after day, they took the Flying Scotsman from King's Cross to Edinburgh in under 6 hours. They were the first diesels in Britain to run at 100 miles an hour as a matter of routine. By the late 1970s, the Hull Executive, a Class 55 working, was the fastest locomotive hauled service in the country, averaging better than 91 miles an hour from King's Cross to Retford. And in 1971, when Roy Budd's theme opened Get Carter and Michael Caine rode north in the corner of a compartment, the machine on the front of that train was a Class 55. For 20 years, on the eastern side of Britain, the Deltic was simply the sound of going north. Stand at the end of the platform at King's Cross in 1965, with a notebook in your pocket, and nothing else on the network sounds remotely like this. At Idle, that uneven, snapping bark, 3 crankshafts hunting for each other through the gear train. The smell of hot oil drawn out of gasworks tunnel on the slipstream of the departure ahead. Then the driver opens up, and the bark becomes a rising howl as 3,300 horsepower goes down through the traction motors, and 100 tons of locomotive accelerates uphill into the dark of the tunnel mouth. Drivers who had begun their working lives on A4 Pacifics in the early 1950s ended them on Class 55s in the late 1970s, and a striking number of them said the diesel was the finer machine of the two. The engine had conquered the sea and then conquered the railway. It seemed unanswerable. But in the offices of the depot superintendents at Finsbury Park, Gateshead and Haymarket, a different ledger was being kept. Roughly every 5,000 running hours, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 miles, a Deltic engine had to come out of the locomotive altogether, not opened up in the shed, removed, complete, and sent away to a specialist works. This was not a depot job, and it was never going to become one. At first, the engines went back to the Vulcan foundry where they had been built. From around 1966, when the English Electric Service contract expired, the work passed to British Rail Engineering Limited at Doncaster. And here, the seed planted on the Acton test beds in 1950 finally broke the surface. The knowledge needed to overhaul a Deltic, the feel of a phasing gear correctly set, the particular note of injection timing beginning to drift, the look of a piston crown running hot before any instrument would admit it, lived in a small number of trained men, and it had taken years to put it there. British Railways was operating the most powerful diesel fleet on its network without owning the expertise that kept it alive. When Doncaster took the work in-house, the consequences arrived quickly. Fractured cylinder liners, weeping liner seals, broken quill shafts, the hollow drives connecting each crankshaft to the phasing gears. Through 1970, the failures multiplied, and by late that year, at the worst of it, roughly half of the 22 locomotives were out of service at the same time. Half of the flagship fleet of the East Coast Main Line standing silent, waiting for hands that no longer existed in sufficient numbers. And while Doncaster wrestled with engines it had never been taught to understand, the parent company was asking a colder question entirely, which was whether Napier needed to exist at all. This is the part of the story I find hardest to sit with. Napier had produced the most extraordinary diesel engine in British history. The Class 55s were, on every measure of performance that mattered, the most successful express diesels in the country. And English Electric, looking at the accounts, concluded that the sensible course was to stop funding new Napier designs and to move the manufacture of spare parts to Paxman, its other diesel business in Colchester. There was no scandal in it. There was no dramatic collapse. There was an accounting decision taken quietly, and the greatest engine firm of the piston age began to be wound down while its masterpiece was still hauling the Flying Scotsman. The cheaper future was already on rails. In 1962, English Electric had built DP2, a locomotive wearing a Deltic body but carrying a single conventional 16-cylinder four-stroke, and from it came the Class 50 of 1967. The Class 50 produced 2,700 horsepower, a fifth less than a Deltic, and on raw performance there was no contest at all. On running cost, there was also no contest. The Class 50 could be maintained at a depot, its overhaul intervals were longer, and its engine never had to leave the locomotive for a specialist works. Of the two comparisons, it was the second that the accountants read. The champions of the Deltic, meanwhile, were leaving the stage one by one. Sir George Nelson had died in 1962. In 1966, Jerry Fiennes became general manager of the Eastern region, and in 1967 he published a book, an unsparing account of mismanagement, perpetual reorganization, and political interference on the nationalized railway. And for the offense of telling the truth in print, British Railways sacked him. The man who had won the Deltics their place on the East Coast was gone 5 years after they entered service, and if you are feeling the shape of this story by now, the brilliance built by a handful of people and then dismantled by decisions taken far above their heads, subscribe because that shape runs through almost every film on this channel, and there are many more of them waiting for you. Then, on the 6th of September 1968, the General Electric Company absorbed English Electric in a merger smoothed into being by the Industrial Reorganization Corporation. Arnold Weinstock, managing director of GEC since 1963, now controlled the largest electrical engineering group in Britain, and Napier became a subsidiary of a subsidiary inside a conglomerate that had no particular use for it. There was no successor to the Deltic, because every attempt at one had already failed. The Nomad, a compound diesel aero engine of staggering complexity, had been cancelled in 1955 with £5,100,000 spent. The Eland turboprop had gone to Rolls-Royce in 1961, and the Gazelle turboshaft with it. Rolls-Royce, Bristol Siddeley, and de Havilland had won the gas turbine age. Napier had not. The Deltic was the last engine of consequence the firm would ever build, and after 1968, the tradition that had produced the Lion, the Sabre, and the Deltic survived only as an entry in a conglomerate's ledgers. The company did not die in a moment. It was simply left with no reason to continue being itself. On the railway, the arithmetic closed in through the 1970s. Every Deltic overhaul still meant an engine out of the frame and away to a specialist works, and every one of those overhauls cost more than the equivalent work on a Class 50. The depot men who had celebrated these locomotives in 1962 were by 1973 holding quieter conversations about whether the fastest machines on the network could still be justified at all. The crisis at Doncaster in 1970 had hardened every doubt, and the replacement was already designed. The Intercity 125, the high-speed train, entered service on the Western region on the 4th of October 1976. 2 Paxman Valenta engines to a set, 4,500 horsepower combined, and crucially, engineered from the first drawing to live inside British Rail's own maintenance capability. No outside specialists, no engines lifted out every 5,000 hours. The first sets reached the East Coast Main Line in May 1978, and the full timetable, delayed by the collapse of Penmanshield Tunnel, arrived in late August 1979. Against that, 22 hand-built thoroughbreds from 1961 had no argument left to make. Withdrawal began in January 1980. 3 went that year, 16 more in 1981. There was no reprieve coming, and the institution made certain of it. In November 1981, with the survivors still earning their keep on the main line, Doncaster Works dismantled its Deltic engine overhaul facility. The locomotives still running were now running on borrowed maintenance, kept alive with parts stripped from their own condemned sisters. British Rail permitted itself one quiet gesture. 55,002 had been repainted into its original two-tone green for its final months, chosen for the National Railway Museum, and the withdrawn 55,005 was held back from the cutters as insurance, in case the chosen one should fail before the end. Even the mercy was administrative. The final revenue working ran on the 31st of December 1981, when 55019 Royal Highland Fusilier took the 4:30 in the afternoon Aberdeen to York, forward from Edinburgh, and came to rest at York just short of midnight. 2 days later, on the 2nd of January 1982, came the farewell tour, the Deltic Scotsman Farewell. 55,015 Tulia took the morning departure north out of King's Cross. 55,022 Royal Scots Grey brought the working back. And 55,009 Elyssadon shadowed the train between Peterborough and Newcastle as a standby in case of failure. One last piece of operational caution for a class that had spent 20 years being watched over by specialists. There was a brief anxious halt at Newark for a suspected hot axle box, and then on again. Along the line side from London to the border stood the enthusiasts, and among them stood railwaymen who had first laid hands on these locomotives in 1962, men now in their 50s, watching the sound of their working lives go north for the last time. On the 27th of February 1982, the works at Doncaster held an open day of farewell, and around 15 of the locomotives were drawn up together on the sidings for the crowds. It looked like a tribute. It was a condemned line. Through that year, the scrap line at Doncaster became a place of pilgrimage. Enthusiasts travelled from across the country to photograph the condemned locomotives standing nose to tail, nameplates removed, cabs stripped, waiting their turn. Some of the men at that fence had stood at the end of the platform at King's Cross as boys with notebooks. Now they recorded the dismantling of the fastest fleet Britain had ever built, one frame at a time. Within months, 16 of the 22 had been cut up, and among them were machines in sound working order, machines fresh from full overhaul, machines with years of mechanical life left in them. To British Rail, the sums were closed and unambiguous. The replacement was running. There was no case on paper for keeping a single one. 6 survived, and they survived only because people moved fast. 55,002, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, went to the National Railway Museum, and on the day of that same Doncaster Open event, it ran to York under its own power. 55,022 Royal Scots Grey and 55,016 Gordon Highlander were bought by the Deltic 9000 Fund, the second of them for £7,500, the price of the metal it was made from. 55015 Tulia went to a private buyer and would join the Deltic Preservation Society only in 1986. And 55009 Elyssadon and 55019 Royal Highland Fusilier went directly to the Society itself, founded in 1977 by people who had seen this exact moment coming 5 years before it arrived. The handover took place at Doncaster on the 20th of August 1982 at a little over £15,000 apiece. £15,000 for the most powerful express diesel Britain ever built. That is what stood between these machines and the cutter's torch. Not policy, not sentiment from above. Ordinary people, passing a collection round. By then, the world that made these engines had already gone. The Acton Aero Engine Works had closed in stages from 1962, after Rolls-Royce took Napier's aviation business, and through the 1970s the Napier name itself dissolved into the GEC group until nothing operational remained of it. The drawings survived in archives, and this is the point where the whole story narrows to a single truth. Paper records what was decided. It does not record what was known. The things the experienced Deltic men carried, the touch of a phasing gear set true, the change in the engine's voice when the injection timing began to wander, the color of a piston crown running too hot before any gauge confessed it. None of that lived on paper. It lived in people. Some of it passed to younger hands at the Deltic Preservation Society, at Doncaster, at Barrow Hill at the Great Central. And some of it walked out through the gates of the Vulcan Foundry, of Netherton, of Doncaster Works, on retirement days through the 1970s and 1980s, and was never written down anywhere by anyone, and is now beyond recovery. The engines were saved by volunteers. The company that created them was already a memory before the last one turned a wheel. Stand at King's Cross today, out at the end of Platform 8. Close your eyes. A winter morning, somewhere around 1965. Hear the idle first, that snapping, uneven bark, 3 crankshafts pulled into step by Penn Warden's gearing. Smell the warm oil rolling out of Gasworks tunnel. See the driver leaning from the cab window to talk to a fitter, a man who fired a fours as a boy and will retire off this machine. See the boys with notebooks at the platform end, and further down the years, see the same boys as men in their 40s with cameras, on a cold Saturday in January 1982, recording the last one out. Now open your eyes. A bright, quiet terminus. An electric train. A gentle hum where the thunder used to be. Napier built one engine that truly mattered, and built it so well that it outlived the firm, the works, and the men. The opposed piston idea itself did not die either. It was taken up again in California from 2004, and in 2025, the technology passed onward into new hands for new aircraft. The idea survived. 6 locomotives survive with it, kept running by volunteers who taught themselves what Acton, the Vulcan Foundry, and Doncaster once knew. We have the recordings, and we have the machines. What we do not have is the firm that imagined them, the works that built them, and the men who could hear 3 crankshafts fall out of true from the other side of a shed. They built it. We did not keep it. If you drove one out of King's Cross, if you started one in the engine room of a minesweeper, or if you were one of those children at the end of the platform when the sound came up out of the tunnel, put it in the comments below. Every one of them gets read.